The monarchy, or more to the point perhaps, the royal family. They have moved among us for generations, stirring emotion, friendship, affection, wonder, reverence. The bonds, mystical and historic, are not easily defined. Family, sometimes unwanted but never broken, these are the ties that bind. For 200 years, we've welcomed members of this family to our shores. Come world wars and death, come economic uncertainty and political turmoil, the rituals remain the same, century after century. Yet our royal traditions are older still. They reach back to the very beginnings of our history. To a time when France and England, two mighty European monarchies, engaged in the race for colonies, the key to wealth and power. In Canada, it was France that won the first round. Samuel de Champlain sailed down the St. Lawrence in 1608 and established the first permanent settlement in the name of the king. For 150 years, our destinies were shaped by the lilies of France. But in 1759, that all changed. In a mighty battle on the Plains of Abraham, Wolfe's British forces defeated the French under Montcalm. It was a Canadian battle, but it was a European war. And when it was over, we were the loyal subjects of His Britannic Majesty. The year was 1760. Enter King George III, Canada's first English monarch and father of our first royal visitor. Prince William was the third son of King George III, a fun-loving sailor prince with a passion for the ladies. He visited Canada first in 1786 and returned periodically on naval duty. He stopped at Quebec and Newfoundland and at Halifax, home of the Citadel, which received much attention from our next royal visitor, Prince Edward, later Duke of Kent, and William's younger brother, who arrived in 1791. As commander of the British forces, Prince Edward set out to make Halifax North America's Gibraltar. He rebuilt the Citadel's crumbling battlements and added lots of cannons. A strict disciplinarian with a passion for punctuality, he built the citizens of Halifax a town clock and placed it on a hill, so there'd be no excuse for lateness. But his major claim to fame is that he fathered Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne at the age of 18. About 4 feet 9 inches tall, she was not a prepossessing figure, but she loomed large over the empire for 64 years. She never came to Canada. She hated to travel. But in 1860, she did send her son, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. He was 19 years old, and he created quite a stir. In Halifax, the entire town came out to greet him. They cheered him as the honored son of the beloved Queen, their warm and constant friend. He acknowledged by continuously bowing and toured the town on horseback to thunderous salutes. As he entered Quebec, he was greeted by bells and cheers and flags of every color. Beneath the cliffs, every available space was covered by people who'd waited since dawn to see him, and salutes from 3 men of war shook the city again and again. In Montreal, where he was greeted by 40,000, he drove the last rivet of the Victoria Bridge that spanned the St. Lawrence River. And all across the country, the future King Edward VII danced his way into the heart of every lady that he met. That visit of 1860 left little doubt about our feelings for the monarchy. And although we debated the terms of a Canadian union, the Crown remained a central part of the plan. On July 1st, 1867, the provinces of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia united into one dominion. We had achieved confederation, and the monarchy had been unanimously maintained. In January 1901, a matronly Queen Victoria, monarch since 1837, died in her bed, and Edward VII, 60 years old and impatient to reign, took the throne. He sent his son, Prince George, Duke of Cornwall and York, to Canada that year. The prince and his wife, Princess Mary, traveled the country by train, and we showed them our prospering land. From September to December of 1901, from east to west, through country and city, we showed them a youthful nation that marched to the tune of progress. But by 1910, Prince George was our king, and our youth was soon marching to war. August 1914. Many of us were on holiday when the news broke that Britain was at war. But thousands rallied to the flag, and by October, the first Canadian contingent, 33,000 strong, headed overseas. We were a tiny nation, but we sent 600,000 of our best. And more than 60,000 just never came home. To the men who returned from the First World War, August the 11th, 1919 was Joy Day, the day that Edward, Prince of Wales, eldest son of King George V, came to Canada to meet them. To the veterans, he was a soldier prince who'd shared the suffering of the Great War. To the women, a youthful replica of sons and lovers lost. In Montreal, crowds broke through police lines just to touch his car. And in Toronto, veterans lifted him bodily from his horse to his place on the platform. "Put her there, Eddie," said a veteran, and Eddie did. So many times that by Sudbury, he had to retire his hands from imperial service. We flocked to see Prince Edward, because he made us feel young. And he bought a ranch in Alberta because we made him feel free. It was a feeling he cherished, and in 1927, he returned to Canada to help us celebrate our Diamond Jubilee. We were 60 years old, and we were throwing a national party because we had come of age. Now 33 years old, Prince Edward was still the ever-handsome and youthful bachelor. He stirred our imaginations, and we couldn't get enough. He opened the Prince's Gates at the Canadian National Exhibition that year, and the doors of Toronto's Union Station, while the veterans cheered him hoarse. It was a high time. But it came to an abrupt halt, and there was nothing we could do about it. In October 1929, the stock market pulse of the country's economy fell with a thud. It was the beginning of the Great Depression, and it lasted 10 long years. There was no justice. Its reach was indiscriminate. No matter who you were, your job, your house, your land was gone. Then, in January 1936, more bad news. King George V, our 70-year-old monarch, was dead. And unknown at his funeral, his son, the adored Edward, Prince of Wales, would never wear the crown. He would forsake the throne for the woman he loved, American divorcee Wallis Simpson. And as Canadian reporter Lotta Dempsey remembers, it was an event that affected us deeply.
I remember the day he abdicated. I was in New York and up in Radio City, way up in the Rainbow Room. Some of the older people will remember that. And he came on and made the speech, and of course it was radio, we'd no television then. And as he started to speak, people started to move over toward the one radio out of all the little tables, places we were sitting, and we all stood there absolutely quiet. And mostly Americans, but here we were two Canadians and people who liked royalty very much, and the tears rolled down our cheeks, and I said to someone, "That's our king, the future king gone." It was a very moving moment.
If there is to be a monarchy, then there must be a king, and it was left to Albert, Edward's younger brother, to take the crown. On May 12, 1937, a procession made its way to Westminster Abbey, and thousands gathered with mixed emotions to watch the event. Among them, a Canadian, Strome Galloway.
The abdication of Edward VIII, I think, made the coronation of George VI all the more glorious. And it made George VI and his queen all the more beloved, because the people felt terribly let down by Edward VIII. He had been the golden-haired prince for years. The public, as a whole, thought that he really let them down. He was a bounder. And they dismissed him from their minds completely, and they saw this other chap forced into this position, not a healthy man. George VI was not a well man, and they saw him forced into this position with his young wife, and they were all for them. I think it was a bigger thing than if Edward himself had been crowned as a bachelor king.
But the man who accepted the crown was not so sure. Untrained for kingship, and afflicted with a terrible stammer, King George VI was filled with self-doubt. Yet he had one priceless advantage: his wife, crowned Queen Elizabeth, and his family. His marriage in 1923 to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had produced two children, Elizabeth, 11 at the coronation, and 6-year-old Margaret Rose. From this devoted family circle, the king derived his strength, and it would soon be tested, for Europe was advancing once again along a path to war. In May 1939, as the king and queen prepared for their month-long visit to Canada, we prepared to welcome a reigning monarch for the very first time. We were euphoric at the prospect, and our welcome was intensified by our sense of impending doom.
The sunshine and the public view once more, the royal party begins another triumphal procession. Quebec's reserve is shattered once and for all. The entire city offers the king and queen an ovation unprecedented in its fervor. Three little maids in white bring tangible evidence of their affection. A floral tribute for Her Majesty the Queen. All rules of protocol, learned in hours of patient rehearsing, must be observed, of course. The tots advance on their exalted mission with dignity that runs into some difficulties. The unveiling of Canada's National War Memorial is one of the most moving events during the entire royal tour. Here, monarch and subject, soldier and civilian, meet on the common ground of remembrance. Reverently, the king places a wreath from himself and the queen. In this gesture, he expresses the gratitude of all the Commonwealth to men and women of Canada who gave their lives. Nearly a mile above the sea, high in the Rockies, then offers welcome and brief relaxation to their majesties. For a day, matters of state are laid aside, and the Prime Minister joins the monarchs for a chat. One may wonder at their seeming obliviousness to the magnificent scenery, but there's a reason. Photographers, like poor relatives, are always present, and even though it is a private day of rest for their majesties, with their usual graciousness, they have consented to pose for the royal train cameramen. It speaks well for their majesties' physical strength that only 2 days' rest from their rounds of ceremonies have been considered a necessary safeguard of health. At Bigger, Saskatchewan, cheers rise from bleachers on both sides of the railway track. It's hail and farewell as the big train slowly gathers speed on its eastbound journey. But young and old, they've seen the king and queen. They've had an opportunity to look on the royal guests and a chance to show their loyalty.
The royal couple traveled the country by train, and they were surrounded by admiring crowds. Among them, the occasional amateur cameraman like Leighton Elliott, who recorded his family's preparations for the Toronto visit on rare color film, as his daughter Flavia remembers.
This is the front door of our home on Highland Avenue in Rosedale. My mother parts the door curtain and comes out dressed for her visit to the legislature building. You had to eyeball them, or else if you went to the theater, to the movie, you saw the movie tone news, but you didn't see it in color. It was always black and white and grainy, so you really relied on your own eyeballs to see the king and queen as much as you could.
As Brian Kelly, then an 18-year-old Toronto student, remembers, it was common practice to place a penny on the track so you'd have a flattened copper souvenir.
This was at the Weston Station. Yeah, there we are, collecting pennies, souvenirs. You know, it was something that the majority of youngsters anyway wanted. Everybody seemed to get involved. It was really a wonderful experience.
But as Lotta Dempsey recalls, the threat of war also lent the visit a sense of poignancy.
There was a sense of impending doom, and you know how that makes for excitement, that maybe this will be gone, and we want to enjoy every minute of it. And it was a very innocent kind of enjoyment. But it was a very strange period, and we couldn't quite comprehend it, because we all, those of us who had been children in the first war and remembered anything about it, everybody said, this is the war to end all wars. There'll be never any more wars. And there we were.
On September 10th, 1939, 1 week after Britain declared war on Germany, Canada followed suit, and another roll call of bloodshed had begun. In London, it was suggested that the princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, be sent to Canada for safety. But as Colonel Strome Galloway remembers, the King and Queen were unwavering in their response.
You will recall that during the war, the king refused to let his family leave London. It was said that they would stay in London, the royal family, the same as the other humbler families of the realm. This was the example they showed during the war, one of them, that made their role so vital in the morale of the people, standing as it did. And don't forget, in war, your armies may fight bravely at the front, but if the civilian population pack it up, no armies on the perimeter will win a battle. The people at home have got to win the war. And this is how the royal family helped win the war.
May 8th, 1945. VE Day. We were celebrating the end of the war in Europe, and from the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the royal family joined in. We'd fought 5.5 years for this, and we'd had our fill of sorrow. We were ready for a love story, and Princess Elizabeth obliged. The 21-year-old Elizabeth had set her cap for Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a young naval officer and a prince of Greece, and when he proposed, she accepted. It was hailed as a fairy tale romance, and on November 20th, 1947, all eyes were on the royal pair. So much so that when a nervous Philip left too early for the wedding and had to go back home, it was a newsworthy event. After years of war and rationing, the royal wedding was a grand and glittering romantic release. and the ceremony in Westminster Abbey seemed to signal that youth and hope had survived. In Canada, we looked on the newlyweds as our royal couple. When their first child, Prince Charles, was born on November 14th, 1948, we celebrated. And when they came to Canada, we were overcome. Oh, we were warned in the press not to gush because it wasn't dignified. But from the moment the royal couple landed on Canadian soil in October 1951, gush is exactly what we did. And who could blame us? We abandoned ourselves to them. They were young and they were beautiful. They were the Charles and Diana of their time. In Quebec City, they visited the legislature and attended a ball that was staged in their honor. And at the National War Monument in Ottawa, which the King had visited just 12 years before, they laid a wreath to honor Canada's war dead and our effort on Britain's behalf. Like a favorite niece and nephew who were visiting from abroad, we dragged the royal couple sightseeing. They took a trip to our most famous tourist attraction, Niagara Falls. And like any pair of tourists, they donned rubber boots and raincoats and took a close-up look. In Regina, our legendary cold made an October appearance, and a hastily designed plexiglass bubble, suggested by Prince Philip, was put to excellent use. It kept the young princess toasty while affording us a view. For 5 weeks, they traveled the country by train, from one coast to the other. We fed them wild rice and beef stew and salmon. We took them square dancing and to a hockey game. And in Calgary, since it was late in the season, we even staged a mini stampede just for them. It was a mutual love affair. And as the trip progressed, the royal couple, by their own admission, felt increasingly at home. We'd moved their imaginations, and we'd touched their hearts. In Saint-Agathe, north of Montreal, the villagers had two rare glimpses. One of Philip driving the princess to divine service at Trinity Anglican Church, and one of her chastising him when he went into a skid. But the couple also found time for a vacation. For an entire Saturday, they escaped the rigors of the tour at a private estate. With Philip at the reins, they took a sleigh ride through the soft snows of a Canadian winter. And they built a chubby snowman and dubbed him Mr. Churchill. The acclaim you have given us has seemed to have the breadth and the immensity of the sea, said the princess. And in Newfoundland, from which the royal couple departed, that was certainly so. Along the new planked wooden jetty of Portugal Cove, thousands gathered to say farewell, and the wind snatched away their voices as well as their reserve. To strains of the squid jigging ground and Will Ye No Come Back Again, the royal visitors began their journey home. I thank you and wish you not goodbye but au revoir, said the princess. But when she returned, it was as queen. On February 6, 1952, less than 3 months after her return to London, her father, King George VI, was dead. And at the moment he succumbed, a new queen, a 25-year-old wife and mother, inherited the crown. We had entered the age of the Second Elizabeth. On June 2nd, 1953, Queen Elizabeth II made her way to Westminster Abbey for the coronation ceremony. This moving ritual would confirm her accession to the throne as it had confirmed her forebears for 1,000 years. And it would symbolize the beginning of a very different way of life for a young mother and her family.
Promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possessions and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs.
I solemnly promise so to do.
Three months after her accession, Queen Elizabeth moved her family to Buckingham Palace, and the nursery, long quiet, was filled with the sound of children's laughter, and occasionally screams if a royal battle broke out like the one seen here. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh wanted both their children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, 1 year his junior, to lead as normal a life as possible. But the demands made on a sovereign's time meant adjustments for them all. There were frequent royal tours, and in October 1957, Elizabeth made her first visit to Canada as our Queen. It was an historic event for Canadians, the first time a reigning monarch had come to open our Parliament. But we were prepared, and even the Mounties, who'd been forced to rehearse with a farm wagon, did us proud.
Isn't she radiant, and isn't she lovely? His Royal Highness wearing the uniform of the Army. Here they come through the gates now. What a beautiful sight.
Oh, look at it. Oh, what a sight.
And the royal couple come through the gate. And there they go, down Sussex Drive, on their way to Parliament and into the pages of Canadian history. Now the carriage is directly in front of us. What a marvelous sight. Lovely.
Her Majesty the Queen and His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, standing beneath the great Gothic arch over the entrance to the Canadian Houses of Parliament. Here is the royal salute. Somehow when you look at a picture like that, you get a feeling that it isn't real. It's like something you've seen in magazines and on books for years since you were a child. And now they are here in person to open our Parliament.
A brief 2 years later, they were here in person again, this time on a cross-country tour. And the young monarch, nervous but game, faced the cameras of a fledgling CBC TV.
The last time I spoke to you from this, my home in Ottawa, was when I opened the new Parliament nearly 2 years ago. I am reminded of this because, as you saw, I can look through the trees to the lovely skyline on Parliament Hill. This is just one of the many beautiful scenes of the Canadian outdoors which we have so much enjoyed since our arrival in Canada. I'm sure you can understand why this tour has given me and my husband such pleasure, and why we are looking forward to the rest of it so much. We would like to see many more of you, and far more of this wonderful country, but it cannot be done this time. Canada is simply too big. Luckily, the television network reaches most of the country, so I can at least bring this rather more personal message directly into your homes, even if I cannot drive through your streets and meet some of your fellow citizens. I hope television will also let you come with me to the different parts of Canada I am going to visit.
And visit she did, zigzagging 15,000 miles across this country in just 45 days. The highlight of the trip was the official opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. This was a joint Canadian and American project, and after the ceremony, the Queen sailed down the seaway aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, accompanied by President Eisenhower and Canada's then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. 1959 was very much a media tour. The Queen's every smile, her every frown was recorded relentlessly on film. Every ordinary citizen, too, seemed to be pointing a camera. And then there was television. It was a technology that would come of age with Queen Elizabeth. In time, it would change the face of her reign. But even during this early tour, it showed a propensity for capturing forever what you'd just as soon forget. As when an amused Queen Elizabeth climbed in, then out, of a car that wouldn't start, abandoning her embarrassed chauffeur to a hungry press. In Montreal, the city held a ball for the Queen and Prince Philip, but when the Queen and then Mayor Sartor-Fournier tried to start proceedings, they were hard-pressed to find a place to dance. It seems the 1,900 hand-picked guests, anxious for a royal view, all crowded onto the dance floor, and the Queen and Prince Philip never did find room to foxtrot. It was a tour of varied experience. In Stratford, they attended a performance of As You Like It and met the cast backstage. And in Sault Ste. Marie, they toured a steel mill. At industrial locations like this, Prince Philip proved his worth as a compliment by easing awkward moments and sharing the heavy load. In Calgary, home of the Stampede, the Queen and Prince Philip finally got to see the real thing. They visited the Indian village where inhabitants rolled out a long bearskin rug instead of a red carpet. And they watched the chuck wagon races, which earned a hearty laugh. For 6 weeks, by train, by plane, by ship, they saw Canada as few Canadians had ever done. But after an arduous 3 days in Vancouver and Victoria, the strain on the Queen began to show. Elizabeth II was looking decidedly unwell, and the press charged that the tour amounted to 6 weeks' hard labor. In the Yukon, it was announced the Queen would cancel some engagements, but after a brief rest, she resumed the tour, and it wasn't until she'd returned to London that we learned that she was pregnant. With Prince Andrew's birth in February, we celebrated the first child born to a reigning queen in over 100 years. Our royal family was expanding, and one by one we were making their acquaintance, as we did with Princess Margaret. Attractive, outgoing, and single, she was the new star on the royal horizon, and in Toronto, 500,000 gathered just to see her face.
The moment has arrived. There is our first look at the princess, just turned off young onto Queen, coming directly toward us along Queen Street to City Hall Square.
In Victoria, the first naval review ever held in Canada was staged in her honor, and we tried to pair her off with any eligible Canadian bachelor who happened to cross her path. All for naught, as it happens. For in London in March of 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones. But not everything was rosy. By 1964, nationalist sentiment growing in Canada had taken the form of separatism in Quebec, and a visit by the Queen and Prince Philip to French Canada that year sparked protests and a death threat. Political scientist Paul Benoit explains.
I think the events in Quebec in 1964 have to be put in the context of the Quiet Revolution and the changes that were occurring in Quebec society at the time. I don't think one should focus too much on the Queen as being the particular object of recriminations on the part of French Canadians. But she had become, in the eyes of Quebec nationalists, a symbol for what they felt was foreign, some of them might have used the word oppression, but at least foreign rule. And it was part of a whole ideology of liberation that was current in many, many parts of the world at that time, and that took that particular form in Quebec.
That such shifts in attitude are inevitable must be understood by a constitutional monarch, and the Queen and Prince Philip take it in their stride, as an early interview reveals.
The monarchy is part of the kind of fabric of the country, and as the fabric alters, so the monarchy and its people's relation to it alters. Now, in 1953, the situation in this country was totally different to what it is now. And not only that, we were a great deal younger, and I think young people, a young queen and young family is infinitely more newsworthy and amusing than, you know, we're getting on from middle age, and I dare say when we are really ancient, there might be a bit more reverence again.
1 minute to midnight. In about 58 seconds, Canada will be officially 100 years old. This is the nation's capital. This is the scene. Here we go. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy birthday, everybody.
Gentlemen, let's all sing together Happy Birthday to Canada!
Happy birthday, dear.
The Queen and Prince Philip were here to help us celebrate our 100th birthday. And after the party on Parliament Hill, we took them on a tour of Expo 67, the World Exposition being held in Montreal. She was greeted by shouts of Vive la Reine, and long live the Queen. And it seemed, wrote one journalist, that the monarchy had again become the focal point for the devotion Canadians felt for their country. Two years later, it was our turn to share in an event of royal significance: the investiture of Prince Charles as the Prince of Wales. And on July 1st, 1969, at historic Carnarvon Castle, Elizabeth II, Mother and Queen, presented her eldest son, Prince Charles, to the people of Wales.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. And faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live and die against all manner of folks.
Prince Charles was now 20 years old. It was time for him and his sister Anne to enter the public side of royal life. And just 1 year later, we were introduced. That tour of 1970 was made to celebrate the centennials of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. And for 10 days, the royal family, including Prince Charles and Princess Anne, went to small communities there. There were formal engagements, like this outdoor address to Manitoba's legislature. But for the most part, this was a visit dedicated to ordinary people and the lifestyles they embrace. And each community welcomed the royal family in their own way. In Benard, Manitoba, the royal family was introduced to about 1,000 Hutterites who'd gathered from several communities to meet them. The Hutterites swore they were disciplined enough to stand in controlled groups, but even they lost their normal reserve and began applauding and sprinting emotionally after the royals as the Queen moved from house to house. We discovered that Prince Charles and Princess Anne were pretty ordinary young people, despite the fact, in their father's words, they'd grown up in a museum. And at Baker's Narrows in Manitoba, at an outdoor barbecue, Prince Charles dined on porterhouse steak.
You're going to be with a degree as well. In what? In but not. Can you study nursing at university? Yes. You can.
The royal family frequently went their separate ways to see as much as possible. And on one such outing, Princess Anne found herself at Duck Bay, a Métis settlement located north of Dauphin, Manitoba. But it was in the Northwest Territories that the royal family found the greatest pleasure. Here, Prince Charles could take the controls, and the royal family could just be themselves. In northern communities like Resolute Bay, the royal family, dressed in Eskimo parkas, watched native demonstrations of traditional skills. And the Queen, touched by their simplicity, said thank you for being who you are. In Tuktoyaktuk, clouds obscured the midnight sun, but not the local pleasures. And the royal family trooped into a gymnasium where Inuvik drum dancers told the stories of their people in mime and rhythmic movement. In all, the royal family responded to the North with uninhibited delight. Back home in London were two royal children we had yet to meet. Prince Edward, who'd been born in March of 1964, and Prince Andrew. Too young yet to consume the public interest, they still enjoyed what passes for privacy in royal family life. But not so Princess Anne. 23 and newly married, she was now a personality in her own right. Even this informal visit to Ottawa with her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, in 1974 was considered an event. Undeterred by the Canadian winter, they good-naturedly went tobogganing and later horseback riding, a mutual interest that brought the royal couple back to Canada as Olympic competitors in 1976. The Queen looked on with undisguised pride as Britain's athletes filed into Montreal's Olympic Stadium. The entire royal family was here to watch Princess Anne and her husband compete, and it was as Queen and Mother that Elizabeth II opened the Olympic Games in Montreal.
Je proclame l'ouverture des Jeux olympiques de 1976. Célébrons la 21e Olympiade de l'ère moderne. I declare open the Olympic Games of 1976, celebrating the 21st Olympiad of the modern era.
Her Majesty the Queen, along with members of the royal family, Prince Edward, Prince Andrew, and Prince Charles, are in attendance as Her Royal Highness the Princess Anne, competing for Great Britain, comes into jump number 2 on her horse Goodwill, standing 26th at this moment.
It is the one thing I do well and can be seen to do well, Princess Anne has said about her riding. And as an anxious family looked on, she displayed the skills of a fine athlete. And following a tumble, the courage of a good sport. We were getting to know our royal family increasingly as individuals. And in 1977, 16-year-old Andrew returned here, this time to study at Lakefield College, a private school north of Peterborough, Ontario. We introduced the grade 12 student to ice hockey and to the joys of North American hamburgers. And at the Queen's request, we tried to treat him as normally as possible. But when you're royalty, there's just no escaping your public. We'll follow you to the ends of the earth. Or at least to the edge of it, as Prince Charles learned when he went diving under the Arctic ice. That adventure earned him the respect of fellow divers and reporters who covered this visit to the north he enjoys so much. Prince Charles returned to Canada to mark an event of historic importance to Alberta's native people, the reenactment of the signing of Treaty No. 7. At Blackfoot Crossing, he smoked a peace pipe in remembrance. And on the Blood Reserve, he took the name of Red Crow, which had been given to another Prince of Wales, Edward, in 1919, and danced a ceremonial dance. While in Calgary, he even managed to fit in a term as Grand Marshal of the Stampede Parade.
I do enjoy my job, and I think that the important thing to remember is that it is a job, of course. And as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best jobs you could ever have. It was my grandfather, more than anybody else, King George VI, who said really we're more a family firm than anything else. But of course, the most important thing, I think, is that the whole idea of monarchy, certainly as far as the Commonwealth is concerned, is a family. And I always feel that this is the strongest aspect of it in many ways. I've also learned a great deal from my parents, who have been more wise and marvelous, I think, in my particular upbringing than I could have imagined possible. And it's their wisdom and understanding and advice and essential practicality which has meant a great deal to me, particularly. And I've absolutely no hesitation in saying so. And I know they will go on doing so as well.
There was little doubt, as Elizabeth celebrated her silver jubilee, the 25th year of her reign, that those sentiments were shared. That year, we invited the Queen with Prince Philip at her side to open our Parliament. It was only the second time she'd done so, and nearly 20 years to the day since we'd watched that historic journey in black and white on televisions across the land. Later, a relaxed monarch strolled with then Governor-General Jules Léger and Madame Léger on the grounds of Rideau Hall, and she reminisced about the trip she'd made as princess.
You see, when we first came in 1951, we went by train, and we got into the train, and we went straight across Canada and back again.
And you, Sheldon?
The greenhouse still kept.
Yes, we have redone it completely. I don't know if you'll have a chance to have a look. Now we've made it into a sort of a place that we can use in the winter, where we can have lunch.
You can actually sit in it.
All this place has been completely redone, and it is truly lovely and very useful.
It's quite an interesting thing to have in one's garden, isn't it? You know, we've got that enormously tall one from British Columbia. That's in the park at Windsor. Oh, and it's a source of great interest to people who come and look at the totem pole.
Of all our royal visitors, there's one who holds an especially large place in Canadian hearts. Elizabeth the Queen Mother may be the nearest thing we have to a legend in her own time. When she visits, it's a love affair. And she's known affectionately as the Queen Mum. In June 1979, the Queen Mother visited the garrison grounds in Halifax that she'd visited with her husband, King George VI, some 40 years before. The old colors marched before her had been presented by her daughter, the Queen, in 1959. And she now presented new colors to the Maritime Command. And in Halifax, on that same visit, she opened the International Gathering of the Clans.
This evening, we are assembled for a great clan gathering. The Scottish clans are flourishing in a happier way than ever before. I'm confident that this will be a joyous coming together of Scots from far and wide. And now, it gives me much pleasure to declare that the International Gathering of the Clans in Nova Scotia in the year 1979 is open.
In London, declarations of another sort were being made, most of them in the press, and all of them concerning this young woman, 19-year-old Lady Diana Spencer. Over the years, a string of young ladies had been linked to the name of Prince Charles. And what we wanted to know was, could this be the one? Seems to be. The royal wedding took place in St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981. And on June 21st the following year, the couple's first child, Prince William Arthur Philip Louis of Wales, was born. He was the third generation of royalty the Queen Mother had held in her arms. A new chapter in royal family history had begun. And in April 1982, the Queen opened a new chapter in our history when she presided over the official patriation of the Canadian Constitution.
It's an incredible turnout. I mean, nobody's making guesses at this point. About a half an hour before the ceremony started, before we went on the air, the RCMP was saying that there was roughly a crowd of 6,000 on the two lawns in front of Parliament Hill. That has easily doubled since then. There is a chance of rain, but at this point, I don't think anything can dampen the enthusiasm and the excitement of this moment.
Ever since Queen Victoria gave her assent to the 1867 Act, my family has been closely involved in the history of the Canadian people. Prince Philip and I are therefore delighted to be with you today to share with you this historic moment in the evolution of Canada. It is one of the quirks of history that over a century should have passed before Canada obtained her own constitution, formulated by Canadians and approved by her own parliament. But the years have not been wasted, and a great nation has grown up in this magnificent land.
We next encountered the royal couple when they steamed into Canadian waters to renew their acquaintance with British Columbia. It had been 12 years since they'd been there together, and an exuberant province welcomed them back.
If affection was any measure of loyalty, it was the provincial capital of Victoria gave the Queen and Prince Philip their most enthusiastic reception. It was blustery and raining, English weather appropriately enough, when the Britannia docked in a specially dredged harbor. The Queen walked from dockside to the steps of the legislature to acknowledge the greeting.
We are now looking forward to renewing our friendship with British Columbians during the coming days.
In Victoria, the most English of Canadian cities, the Queen was indeed coming home.
We just love her. We just love her. We love all the royal family. They're just wonderful family.
Do you think that that this will be one of her last tours of Canada?
No. Oh, no. No, she loves Canada.
And Canada loved her. By the time she left, the royal yacht, she said, looked like a floating flower shop.
It was the first event ever in BC's new Dome Stadium. Nothing during the visit equaled the stadium reception in sheer size and enthusiasm. But the warmth and intimacy of the British Columbia welcome was most evident in the small communities the royal couple visited.
Those small communities included towns like Vernon, BC. And although this visit was a short one, just 4 days long, the people there filled every minute of it with affection and fun. So much so that when the Queen left British Columbia, she said she'd remember this royal visit for a very long time. Something else that will be remembered for a very long time is the visit of Prince Charles and his wife Diana, the Princess of Wales. This may be the sophisticated 80s, but gushing hasn't changed much since 1951, and we were head over heels in love from the prince's first words.
May I thank you very much indeed on behalf of my wife and myself for such a kind and warm welcome here to Canada, and in particular to this traditional and historic part of the world, Nova Scotia. And I have an opportunity to introduce my wife to a large number of Canadians.
The tour got underway in Halifax, where the couple visited St. George's Anglican Church. It had been designed by Prince Charles' ancestor, Edward, Duke of Kent, nearly 200 years before. But the significance of that fact seemed to pale considerably if the couple shook your hand.
And he goes, "What are you going to do after this?" I said, "Not wash my hand again." I couldn't get my little thing to her. I forget what it was, right? And she goes,
flowers.
No, we had a little stuffed animal, and I took it and I gave it to her. She said it was sweet. Oh.
They traveled 18 days in Canada with an adoring crowd in tow. But despite the hectic pace, the royal couple always found time to respond to us with dignity and grace. In Shelburne, Nova Scotia, home of the Loyalists who'd fled revolutionary America in 1783, the couple visited a waterfront museum and talked to a master dory builder. Outside, the citizens, dressed in period costumes, celebrated 200 years since the Loyalist arrival, pleased to have royalty in their midst. From Shelburne, Nova Scotia, they sailed to Loyalist St. John, New Brunswick, where the normally reserved citizens became an adoring mob, and the royal couple were momentarily lost from view. It was a mutual exchange of affection, and everyone, it seemed, wanted to be part of it. The visit was filled with emotion, and by the simple act of touching a hand or accepting a wilted flower, the couple fulfilled a dream for even the youngest child. There was something for everyone, whether it was simplicity you were after or glamour. Fog plagued the royal visit, so much so that Prince Charles joked they might finish their tour of the Maritimes without ever having seen them. In St. Andrews, the mist completely obscured the Britannia, but crowds still gathered. They followed the couple to All Saints Anglican Church, where they were attending morning service. And in Ottawa, an enterprising jogger even pounded the pavement to get a first-hand look at the princess and promptly fell in love. The walkabouts developed into talkabouts, and the royal couple inevitably ran behind schedule because they seemed so loath to leave. They enjoyed working the crowds and changed sides periodically so that no one would feel left out. The princess was obviously the star attraction. But in fairness, her husband had some fans. And when one of them asked for a kiss, he disbelievingly, but charmingly obliged. There was no denying they made a beautiful couple, or that they were very much in love. In St. John's, Newfoundland, in conjunction with the Festival of Youth, the Prince and Princess were entertained at Memorial Stadium by the province's young people. Later, the princess, an avid tap dancer, slipped away to take a close-up look at the dancers' shoes. They seemed to meet with royal approval, and so did the royal couple.
What do you think?
They were pretty nice.
Yeah? What did you expect to see?
Beautiful people.
And are they beautiful people?
They may be beautiful people, but their parents too, as they reminded some 5,000 young people who'd gathered at King George V Park in St. John's.
But we do, as parents, realize the responsibility we now have towards our one child at present, and I hope several more in the future. My wife deserves a medal for the first one, I think.
In response to Newfoundland's warm welcome, Prince Charles was moved to say with regret that they had nothing except themselves to offer in return. But the people of Newfoundland seemed to consider that a fair exchange. At Montague on Prince Edward Island's east coast, 2 pairs of royal feet tapped out an Irish reel as the eastern leg of the tour drew to a close. And as a parting gift, the residents of a senior citizens' home in Summerside presented the couple with a model sailing ship for their son, Prince William. It was time to depart for the West. In Edmonton, the royal couple took part in an unusual event for royalty. Dressed in period costumes styled after clothes worn during the visit by Edward, Prince of Wales in 1860, they attended a barbecue at a reconstruction of an old Hudson's Bay Company fort. And as their last royal act to a tumultuous welcome, they presided over the opening of the World University Games.
Today is a very special day for 3 reasons. It is the birthday of my dear wife.
Not only that, but she had the good sense and the excellent taste to be born on Canada's National Day. I now declare open the 12th World University Summer Games of Edmonton.
It was a series of historic dates in Canada's history that drew the Queen back to see us. And although the 21-gun salute was not to everybody's liking, the royal visit seemed to be, even if the waiting made you restless. In New Brunswick, which was celebrating its bicentennial, the Queen attended a picnic at Fredericton's Wilmot Park. It was an informal affair, and she was treated not only as a guest of honor, but as a special friend. Here was a monarch coming into her own. Even the young people were enthralled with her, and she seemed to revel in it. At the Queen's own request, there was a command performance of breakdancing, and the local talent enthusiastically complied, as an intrigued royal couple looked on. This was a tour that celebrated our multicultural heritage. And in Toronto, the royal couple visited the city's Italian community, where they received a boisterous welcome. A crowd of 20,000 strained to see them, and it was obvious that the Queen's appeal crossed cultural bounds. Later in Toronto, at Maple Leaf Gardens, the Queen, head of the Church of England with Prince Philip at her side, attended a moving multi-faith service, which underscored the theme of cultural unity and goodwill. While outside, admirers waited patiently to watch her leave.
I'm from the West Indies. She's been my sovereign for all these years, and she will ever be my sovereign.
Thank you. What, the church service isn't the attraction, then?
No, just the Queen. Her Majesty is the attraction.
Her Majesty was also the attraction on the Six Nations Reserve, where the Queen and Prince Philip renewed the faithful covenant between the British Crown and the Mohawk Indians, who'd remained loyal to King George III during the American Revolution 200 years before. It was a visit full of historic significance for Canada. And in Manitoba, where they were celebrating the 250th anniversary of the arrival of the French explorer Pierre La Vérendrye, the Queen participated in a reenactment. To the songs of early French explorers, she greeted a brigade of canoeists, and she seemed to enjoy her role. In Dauphin, Manitoba, the community received what it considered a special honor when the Queen accepted an invitation to their Ukrainian picnic. In the gigantic amphitheater on the site of the annual Canadian National Ukrainian Festival, she was entertained by the Zerka dancers. And later, she made an unexpected and informal visit to the stands. Then in Winnipeg, on the last day of her visit, the Queen unveiled a plaque at the Children's Hospital of Winnipeg's Health Sciences Centre. It's a duty she performs many times a year, but she still made an impression on at least one young patient.
What would you do if you're going to be really, really, really nice to the Queen? What would you say to her?
But when it comes to meeting royalty, not everybody's self-assured. And sometimes a monarch has to help things along. Those are the moments in a royal tour that make departures bittersweet. And in Winnipeg, to the flourish of guns and a drum and bugle fanfare, 2,000 Manitobans said a fond farewell to the woman who is queen and head of our royal family. That family expanded once more in September 1984, with the birth of the Queen's fourth grandchild, the second son of Prince Charles and Diana, Princess of Wales. The baby was christened Henry Charles Albert David, and he was introduced to us in some of the most remarkable royal christening footage the public had ever seen.
Yes, we'll get them afterwards. We'll play with them afterwards. No, Zara. Zara.
What's the matter with you today?
Prince Charles, like his mother before him, was now an heir to the throne, who was raising a young family. And as it always has, the new generation demanded its own star. This was Prince Andrew's first royal tour solo, and the 25-year-old bachelor, fourth in line for the throne, didn't disappoint his fans. In Halifax, he skippered the famous Blue Nose 2 through stormy seas, and his passengers, most of whom were the opposite sex, found no fault with the young lieutenant's seamanship. At a bicentennial commemoration event at St. John's Barrett Green Armory, the enthusiastic young people gave him a welcome usually reserved for a rock star. Here was a teen idol, and for those of us who remembered, it was difficult to believe that this was the same child the Queen had been carrying during her 1959 cross-Canada tour.
I find that the real persona, he eases it. I love him.
It's such an honor to meet someone so important and to really be recognized because he is one of the greatest. He is. And he's so beautiful.
That same year, as one of the new generation of royal family worked his considerable charm on the younger set, we also entertained the Queen Mother. She'd made her Canadian debut almost 50 years before, and she spoke fondly of the memories we share.
On this tour, I have been delighted to have been able to come back to Western Canada, the scene of so many vivid memories for me. It is now some 46 years since I first came to this country with the King. In those anxious days, shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. I shall always look back upon that visit with feelings of affection and happiness. I think I lost my heart to Canada and to Canadians, and my feelings have not changed with the passage of time.
Nor, it would seem, have ours. And the royal family continues to work its magic. They embody 1,000 years of human experience, each generation as different as its era. yet each generation remarkably the same. And we've welcomed them, come rain or come shine, for 200 years. I want to show, said the Queen after her coronation, that the crown is not merely an abstract symbol, but a personal and living bond between you and me. By maintaining a family on the throne, she's done just that, and she's strengthened the monarchy in the process in this constantly changing world. She has paved with dignity the road to the 21st century, and a new generation of monarchy is waiting in the wings. Part modern, part musty, dependable. And just possibly, therein lies its heart.